and support for all students, and inclusivity to celebrate diversity and strength as a welcome to all students. Next slide. This is the definition. Education equity, eliminating the predictability of student outcomes based on render, race, gender, zip code, ability, and socioeconomic status or language spoken at home. This is in that document. So in other words, part of the core values is that they shouldn't expect, if your child has the ability to do well, they should not be able to expect that your child will do well. Isn't that what that says? Yeah. Right? And this is the definition from the Virginia Department of Education. Okay, next slide. Inclusion. The ability to create conditions for all students and staff to feel welcome, valued, and positioned for success. So when I take these two pieces, when I take these two definitions in hand, it troubles me because it makes education a subjective matter when it should be an objective matter. In one piece of the plan, it talks about the instructional core, right? Now, as far as I can tell, there's exactly 5 sentences that actually talk to a strategy in the entire document. And that's what talks about the instructional core, and that lives with the relationship between parent, student, teacher, curricular teacher, student, with regards to academic rigor. And then it's not mentioned again. It talks about things like this. And the problem is that this is unenforceable. How do you make someone feel welcome, valued, and positioned for success? Shouldn't you make them welcome, valued, and in a position for success?
Or just welcome.
Right? If someone's welcome, they're welcome. Being in position for success is not a feeling. It's either a fact or it's not. Either you're ready or you're not ready, and either you demonstrate it in your academic performance and testing, or you don't demonstrate it. So, the backdrop of this plan, this strategy, and the view from here, and from almost every place that I've spoken to over the last year, is this notion of equity. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm going to start typing down and try to put these things in context, okay? Put public education in context. So what we don't realize, for the first 150 years of this country, we did not have public compulsory education, okay? Now the immigration movement of the early 1900s, that is what drove the need for public education. Look at all the stories about Ellis Island and all the immigrants that came in. So why, with an immigration boom, pre-World War I,
Standardization.
not necessarily standardization, something deeper than that. Why? Take a guess. Standardization, you're close. It's not standardization. Uniformity is better. Move over. Assimilation. Education was supposed to, go to the next slide. Education was supposed to be the mechanism of creating the melting pot of America. See what was going on, you know, next slide. What was going on is immigrants came in and settled in communities that were of the same language, race, culture, et cetera, et cetera. And in the wisdom of our government, they viewed that you could not sustain a democracy by creating enclaves of different communities who basically took Italy and stuck it in the Bronx, you know, took this culture and put it there. They weren't American. So compulsory public education was put together to destroy multiculturalism. Public education was put in place to destroy individual identity and to replace and to give them an American identity. It was there to teach immigrants the history, the language, the culture of America. And of course, they could take the best of what they brought over and integrate it into their own culture. I like Italian food, just want to let you know. And it could all blend in. I like Italian food. Scotch whiskey, you got it, right? I can do for a Chinese restaurant, but I'm always hungry an hour later. And this is all America. And that's what its intention was. Next slide. So I'm going to take it in a little picture, and then I'm going to explode this picture as to where we are. Let's talk about Prince William County Schools. Next slide. This is the data. So the 5 largest school districts in Virginia, these are the gaps, the graduation gaps. And the reason why I look at graduation gaps, there's all kinds of numbers that you can look at. The only thing that we can normalize across the state is a graduation gap, right? So, because you're assuming that in the same school, you're gonna have the same standards. So if you have blacks and whites in the same school, there's going to be some uniformity in what the standards are for graduation, okay? So, in Prince William, there's about 2.3%, and this data is as of 2008. I look at pre-COVID data, not post-COVID data, right? So there's a 2.3% difference in the graduation gap between whites and blacks, right? Well within a rounding error in statistics. Not something that's horrible, and not something that a program of equity and inclusion is going to decrease the graduation gap by 2.3%. Okay? It's not going to do that. And these are the questions that our leaders have to answer. They're putting programs in place, yet they can't tell us how these programs are going to increase school performance. I actually went and looked for a study that was evidence-based that could show that focusing on identity issues and equity and inclusion would increase the performance of a student. I found 0. And this is after me and the staff researched for 2 weeks. Okay? Not a single study out there. Stanford in 2016 published a study where they looked at the issue, and the basic conclusion of the Stanford study is they couldn't find the evidence that it works, but they're not going to tell you that it doesn't. I kid you not, that was the conclusion of the study. I'm not going to tell you that it works, but I'm not going to tell you that it doesn't. Maybe we need to do it and see what happens. That was the most authoritative study that I could find on the subject. Next slide. So, I did a presentation to the Racial and Social Justice Commission of Prince William County. In the first iteration I went through, I sent them my slide deck. They kind of brought in some consultant that was supposed to shoot me down. She got blown out of the water. But when it was time for the regular meeting, I came back with more ammunition specific to Prince William County. And this chart that you're looking at has to do with the graduation gap, completion rate, and dropout rates since 2014. I wanted my data to predate equity and inclusion efforts, okay? To show that in the data, these improvements to education in Prince William County preceded these efforts. And therefore, no changes or trends can be attributed to these programs. Okay? So that's what the purpose of that was. And we look at numbers that are infinitesimal, where we look at the differences in the black-white dropout rates. I mean, as far back as what? 2014, it was less than a percentage between black and white students in the Prince William County school system. So when you look at the raw data, it's absolutely for certain that these identity equity programs have no evidence-based usefulness in Prince Williams County. There's no reason for them. There's no data that supports it at all. In fact, the data rebuffs it. And these are the averages. So these average differences show that Prince William County, by focusing on rigor, reading, writing, arithmetic, those kinds of things, that's what has actually been making the difference. And what's unique about Prince William County is of all of the counties with the lowest graduation and dropout gaps, Prince William County has the smallest disparity between race and economic status in the state.
Wow.
My recommendation to the, it's a long name, Racial and Social Justice Commission, after I went through the entire presentation, was you need to realize that you were doing something right, you're about to screw it up, and that the recommendation should be that you do nothing except figure out what you're doing right and do that better. Now, that's exactly what they put in their report. There's no, in their report, they determined that there's no evidence that there are no recommendations to make changes in terms of the academics in racial and social justice that could make an improvement. But they added the sentence, but we're not saying racism isn't a factor. We're just saying we couldn't find a way to prove it was a factor. Because, and then they went on with the They went on with staffing and other stuff, but I didn't speak of those metrics. But I went to that meeting with one ally, and it shocked me that the recommendation came out that way. And that shows the power of information and data, of objective information, objective data. Because the graduation statistics, these are all from the VDOE site. Now they don't present them like this. You have to download each spreadsheet and do the analysis yourself. And we spent 6 weeks doing it statewide. Next slide. So we did this analysis statewide, and the outcomes for us were shocking. Now, this started when I first founded the NSABA, and I had a friend of mine, Colonel Ehrenberg, when I was in the military, and he says, Paul, he goes, Lott, you cannot solve a problem until you quantify it. You have to measure it, you have to identify it. Once you've measured and identified it, then you can come up with strategies and tactics to deal with that problem. Until then, you have nothing to talk about. And I always remember that. So my first step was to say, okay, let's assume that there are disparities that are related to identity, race, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. Where can I find out the measurement of that disparity so that I can see it? So I found in this, on the DVOE site, you can actually download text files. Because by law, every school district has to provide this data every year. So I downloaded all the text files that we started pouring through school district by school district. First thing we did was we looked at, since the organization focuses on black-white, which is, and I'm gonna tell you one reason why. The NSABA doesn't just focus on black Americans, because we have a thing called a poverty cluster. And it turns out that wherever blacks are doing poorly, whites actually do worse, right? They'll tell you in Baltimore, and I'll show the slide, that the graduation rate among blacks is 73%. 73%. But the graduation rate among whites is 72%. It's almost a percentage lower. That's the same in Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, and Chicago, and Los Angeles. The two exceptions that we're able to find is Atlanta, Georgia, and Washington, D.C. The biggest difference being Washington, D.C., but we can explain what Anacostia and the political side where all the money is. They're so far ahead on one side of the city versus the other that you'll see a disparity. When it comes to public education, in every other place in the country, where there's a large black population, whites do worse than whites. Okay? So 94 of 118 school districts, blacks graduate over 90% graduation rate in Virginia. That is astonishing when you think what people think in their heads. You would think it was a lot worse than that. 47 school districts, 40% of the school districts in Virginia, blacks graduate at a higher rate than whites. Wow. 77 school districts, the black-white graduation gate, so you have the 40% where blacks graduate higher, but in 77% of the school districts, the black-white gap is 5% or less. So it's within a tight cluster in terms of performance. There are 8 Virginia schools where there's a double-digit graduation gap, and in half of them, 4, blacks graduate in double digits over white students.
Double digits.
That's in Virginia. Next slide. So, started with the district, then I went to Virginia. Now we're going to expand. I talked about it a little bit. And we continue our studies. We're actually collecting the data state by state. And so far, the pattern's holding. Right? So, one of the demographics, the class of 2017 to the class of 2018, African American students, these are the graduation rates. Right? There was an increase here, there was an increase there in both instances. Black students outpaced white students in graduation rates in Baltimore. You won't hear about that. You won't hear about a news report. You won't hear about it anywhere. What you're going to hear about is a switch and bake. They're going to talk about how the impacts of slavery causes a disparity. And then they're going to but they're going to ignore the fact that those factors don't exist in majority black school systems. 40% of the teachers in Baltimore are black. So the data doesn't match. You know how they get the numbers to fudge? They take, they'll talk about blacks and slavery, and then they'll switch to people of color, because they don't include people that can't speak English in an English school. The graduation rate in Baltimore for Hispanics is 54%. But the problem with the data is that you don't know why things are the way they are, unless you look more closely at the data, unless you separate them out. This trend is the same. In every concentrated black urban area, mostly blacks outperform whites in that same school district. So if you look at the numbers, it can't be a racial problem, and it can't be an issue of equity. It has to be something else. Next slide. So we went to Virginia, we looked at school systems across the country. Now let's look at the ultimate result of things, right? The ultimate goal of education is to be able to graduate and take care of yourself, get a job, financial stability, et cetera, et cetera. So let's look at the trending numbers and the conclusions we'll start with. 1959, black poverty rate 55%, white poverty rate 18.8%. 9 years later, black poverty rate fell 24.7 points to 34.7%. White poverty rate fell 8.8%. The 50 years, and I picked this date because it is the date that the Fair Housing Act was passed. It was the last piece of major civil rights legislation passed. So in the 50 years, from the passing of the last civil rights legislation to 2018, the black poverty rate went to 20.7%. Now the census has adjusted this number to 10.1%. But in either case, white poverty over 50 years went up 0.1%. So if we look at across the entire 50 years, it's oscillated between 7.8% and 14%, which means that poverty among whites in this country is flat. But if you were born black, you were black and poor, you were 3.5 times more likely to escape poverty than a poor white child. My conclusion, there is no such thing as white privilege, and systemic racism is a data impossibility. These are census numbers. These are not my numbers. And the census makes it hard. You have to download the spreadsheets and do the analysis. Next slide. But they did give you that pretty chart. And that chart shows that every racial group in America has improved its position, except for whites.
No, Hispanic whites.
You got it. Right? And these are census data numbers. And so the assumed argument that race and ethnicity plays a germane role in education is false. There's no data to support it. It's just asserted. And we never questioned it. And we form our strategic plans around it. Do you see why I have a problem with this strategic plan?
Yes.
It's based on fiction. This plan, to me, is a paper written on who's the most powerful Jedi. Right? Now, it's like you pretend Star Wars is real, and then you have this debate over who the most powerful Jedi is, and you come up with a strategy and you live your life by it. That's what this plan is. And I'll tell you, I've watched all the Jedi movies, and particularly the early ones. They made me feel emotions. I was excited. I was absorbed in the story. And even though I had deep, passionate feelings about Luke Skywalker and the death of Darth Vader, it don't make it real. And that's what this is about. Feelings. You want people to feel welcome. It's all touchy-feely. When no one has ever asserted that they don't feel welcome. Right? Look at the correlation of this thing. I've spent way too much time dealing with politics, and over the last week talking to senators with bills and things like that, and the because feelings seems to be a large driver in policy. Next slide. So I already said this. These outcomes, they're not real. And because the foundational data that we all think about and rely on is not real, that's why we can't solve our problems, because we can't quantify them. See, Prince William County has a 2.3% problem. That's it. Push this stuff back to grade schools. And then that didn't work. And it didn't work because the human brain doesn't work that way, right? You know, your brain develops from the back to the front, right? In the back of your brain is this thing called the frontal lobes, and it's language and visual spatial. Your language center develops and your visual spatial center develops so that you can look mommy and daddy in the face and learn from them. And the last thing that develops on you is your frontal lobe, your critical thinking skills. So if you're there to teach critical thinking to a kid who's 12 years old, who doesn't have the brain capacity for critical thinking, you're always going to struggle for it. And women, about 16 years old, you got your critical thinking in place. Men, you're literally a teenager until you're 24.
25, she said. 25.
And that's just a physiological fact, right? That's a physiological fact. A man's not full grown until he's about 24 years old, right? While as a woman, her brain is full grown at 16. What does that mean? How should it affect our public education? We need to right size our public education and set our priorities. You know what the first piece prior to public education needs to be? Baseline skills. Everybody needs to be able to read and write and do basic math. That's what everyone needs to be able to do. What we do in public education is we sacrifice that so that they feel good about themselves, but they graduate not being able to do these things. Right? And that is what handicaps them socially. And I can prove it. In Virginia, 85% of everyone who goes to prison will return to prison within 10 years. And 100% of them read below the 8th grade level. Right?
Second thing is single parent household.
So I'm going to hit you up on single parent housing. It doesn't work the way people think that works. Okay? The government didn't come up social programs existed for blacks and whites. And the black women just didn't look up and say, yo man, get out of my house. And the white women said, no, stay. That's not what happened. There's a thing in history, a historical event called the Great Migration. When we look at the years between World War I and World War II, between the wars, each war, after World War I, it spawned a micro-industrial age. And that micro-industrial age created a labor shortage. Because what most people don't know is, you know what coincided with the creation of public schools? Closing of the borders. There was no immigration because the country wanted to integrate the people that it had already brought in masses. So public education was created, but immigration was shut down after that. So post-World War I, when we had our first micro-industrial revolution, there was not enough labor. So 500,000 blacks moved north and west to fill these jobs. That was the first hit to the reduction of poverty, right? 90% of blacks lived in the South during Reconstruction. By 1968, 47% lived in the North and West. Now, after World War I, there was the same problem happening again, but in large scale. World War II in large scale. So what you had in the 1950s, late 40s, early 50s, is you had almost half the population of blacks in the South moving north and west. Okay? That's why you saw a 20.7% drop in the poverty rate.
Yep.
Because they were moving north and west for jobs. And in fact, southern states enacted laws to prevent recruiting because northern companies, steel mills, etc., were going to down south and pulling people off the farms in droves. And so they passed legislation to prohibit it. 80% of all railroads that existed in the United States was built by all black construction crews in the 1950s. So it was the Industrial Revolution that fought poverty. But there were some problems. It took place under segregation, which meant that the blacks who moved north and west were clustered into particular areas. And guess what those areas are? They're areas like West Baltimore, South Chicago, Los Angeles. They're exactly the same areas that suffer poverty today. Why? In 1972, immigration law changed, and that was the beginning of globalization. So what happened was the jobs that blacks had moved north and west for were disappearing. And then the American government, in its genius, did something that no country had ever done in history. They gave people the ability to remain poor where they lived. The problem with cash aid for poverty is in the old days, you'd have ghost towns. Jobs dried up, people moved to the jobs. 1972, jobs dry up, government gives you money, you get to stay in that place that jobs will likely never return. It is the major cause of poverty for whites and blacks. Appalachia, closing up the coal mines, poorest white population in the country. Why are they there? Because the government pays them to stay there.
Wow.
And those coal mines aren't opening up again.
Wow.
And I talked to them.
How would you like to listen to about 2 more?
That is a good place to break.
I'm going to ask Paul to do about 5 more minutes of his best stuff. I'm going to make available a link, I'll tell you where to get it, of his speech to the Social Injustice Commission. Yeah, if you signed
If you
in.
want to know more, there's a book over there with, you can put your name, your email, your phone, leave whatever off you don't want, but if you want to find out more information about this later, so if you can't do it all in one night, sign up there before you leave.
So consider this an appetizer, but if you can do about.
5 more minutes,
maybe
he said.
5 more minutes.
Perfect.
And I will encourage you to look at that video. It will blow your socks. It's more.
We need him to present to the school board.
I'm sorry?
I asked a year ago to have him all invited.
That'll get me, yeah.
He needs to present to the school board.
Yes.
Thank you, Paul. But we'll invite you back. Maybe for a special session.
So this is all making sense. In other words, when we look at the data, there are historical causes to the consequences of the things that we face today. There's a resilient heart study. This is the last piece. There's a resilient heart study that came up with this idea of the vocabulary gap among, it wasn't between blacks and whites, it was between poor and middle class. Basically, these researchers put listening devices in the homes of welfare parents and in upper middle class families. And they recorded the number of words that a child heard in a day. And it turned out that children of wealthier families heard 3 times as many words before preschool as poorer children. Okay? Now, think back to what I told you about the brain. First thing that develops is language and visual acuity. The thing that most people understand is that your brain works the opposite of the way you think it works. You're born with too many brain connections. In other words, you're born too small. And your brain does a process called synaptic pruning. Whatever you don't use, it disconnects. So if you're raised in a stimulating environment, those connections stay connected, and you overperform in school during your school career. If you have a low stimulus environment, those cells disconnect. Now they can reconnect, but it's about 10 times harder to get them to do that. So basically, the synaptic pruning says 1/4 of all the calories you burn per day is burned by your brain. And in a survival mode, the least number of calories your brain uses makes you more able to survive. So if you're not using it, your brain disconnects and turns it off. Which is why universal pre-K doesn't work, and why the effects, according to NIH, are reversed by the 3rd grade. Because they're still not being stimulated consistently over time. Which is why, horrible thing to say, children who are abused usually have very high IQs. Because they live in a high stimulated environment. So what do we do? Understanding public education, we can reverse the long-term effects of the differential by economic status by reaching out to the mothers and helping them before their kids get to school. That's how you increase the long-term performance of minorities and the poor. The key is with the parents before they start school, not with anything else. The other thing, evidence-based. Success Academy in New York State is a school system. I looked at school systems and said, let's look at the best that works across the country. And they have a reading rigor program that goes all 12 years. And to date, it is the most effective at reversing the effect of early synaptic pruning. Because they have a rigorous reading program that goes from kindergarten to 12th grade. And they outperform every other group in the state on standardized tests. And it turns out that reading rigor also increased math scores inversely by 20%. So there's science out there. We know how to fix these problems. But, and I'll end here, our problem is this. We have one mechanic shop in town. And when you take your car and they don't fix it, you have no place else to go. And that doesn't make for innovation. Right? We have the people causing the problems coming in to solve the problems. That's never going to work. Because they're being trained in the same schools and institutions to do the same things that brought us to where we are. So we have to be different, we have to do better. That's another speech, but we'll get there. Thank you so much.